before the suits, before the guns, before the name Capone echoed through courtrooms and alleyways, there was a boy, a son of immigrants, raised in the back streets of Brooklyn, where ambition came cheaper than bread and the American dream wore brass knuckles. He wanted more than survival. He wanted power. And in chasing it, he became something larger than life and darker than legend. This is not just the story of a man. It's the story of the shadow he left behind. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. The air inside Cook County Courthouse hung thick with the smell of damp wool and old cigars, the kind of scent that clings to stone, to time, to people who never expect to leave a building unchanged. It was October 17th, 1931. The room had gone. Quiet in the seconds before the verdict, the way a city quiets just before a storm makes landfall. Not peaceful, but taut, expectant. There were men in every seat, pressed against wood, folded in shadows, waiting to witness something American history had never quite seen before. The fall of a king, not by bullets or bombs, but by balance sheets and taxes. And there he sat, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, 32 years old, heavier than the press photos suggested, and quieter than the myth allowed. His face gave away nothing, not anger, not worry, not even pride. He wore a dark charcoal pinstripe suit, single-breasted, tailored in Miami. His tie was deep navy with a golden fleur-de-lis stitched just off-center. His pocket, square, crisp white, bore the faint embroidery of his initials, AGC, stitched with care by a woman who would die before he returned home again. And in his right hand, between fingers that had once pulled triggers, signed bribes, held the child. He held a half-smoked cigar, not the usual Havana. This one was local, Chicago rolled, dry, unlit, pressed once between his lips. Then forgotten, it rested there, limp, crushed at the middle, like something that started burning but never reached the end. A metaphor, maybe, or maybe just a habit lost in the noise. The jurors filed in, 12 of them, stone-faced, but some with twitching hands. One coughed before sitting. Another adjusted his collar with the kind of slow, trembling movements that signaled dread, not pride. The clerk stood, paper in hand, on the charge of tax evasion. Silence cracked the room, harder than the gavel ever could. We find the defendant, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, guilty. Flashbulbs popped like distant gunfire. 3, then 5, then a dozen more. Each a burst of white light that carved Capone's face into newsprint before he could even blink. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, just blinked once, and let his eyes drift downward, past the table, past the jurors, down to the floorboards, where generations of dust had collected in the cracks like secrets in a confessional. Capone didn't argue, didn't shout, he didn't even turn to his lawyers, who sat frozen, hands on folded briefs, stunned by the thing they couldn't charm or cheat or buy. Numbers, justice, not from a Tommy gun, but from an IRS auditor's pen. Behind him, someone whispered. They got him. Someone else. Took him long enough. A woman older, wrapped in black lace and judgment, crossed herself. Not for Capone, for the country. Outside the courthouse, the streets boiled. Reporters shoved notebooks through cracked windows. Men hollered for a glimpse. Vendors sold copies of the Chicago Tribune hot off the presses with bold red letters. Capone guilty. He had been the face of power, pleasure, fear, and control. And now he was just another man in a courtroom waiting to be taken away. The guards moved in. He stood. And in that moment, that breath between the past and the future, you could almost hear the echo of footsteps on empty marble. as if the building itself knew it would never again house a man quite like this. His cigar dropped from his fingers. It rolled once, twice, then came to rest against the base of the defense table, still unlit, still unfinished. A king exiled not by war, but by math cut to black. And then a voice, calm, weathered, measured, like the turning of old pages in a history book, read aloud. Beside a crackling fire, to understand how Al Capone became America's most feared and, strangely, most beloved gangster, we must go back not to Chicago, but to Brooklyn. Fade in an alley, narrow, 1910s Brooklyn, brick walls stained with soot, laundry strung like flags across tenement windows. Children run barefoot, chasing a stick through puddles slick with oil. And as a butcher calls out in Neapolitan, a radio hums inside a fourth-floor window. Some operatic aria bleeding through static and steam. Somewhere in that neighborhood, in a cramped apartment above a barber shop, a boy writes his name in the condensation of a cracked mirror. Alphonse, they'll call him Al. They'll call him Scarface. They'll call him a monster, a myth, a messiah of crime. But before all that, before the blood and the suits and the throne, there was this: a mother's hands, scrubbed raw from laundry work, a father's silence. As he sharpened razors in the kitchen each night, brothers packed shoulder to shoulder in a 2-room flat, dreaming of more. And a boy who understood, before he ever held a gun, that in America, if you wanted power, you had to take it. But that story is still to come. For now, we sit with the man he became, 32 years old, alone in a holding cell, with walls too white and air too still. He leans back, fingers interlace across his stomach. Somewhere, down the corridor, a radio murmurs the end of a ball game. He doesn't hear it. His thoughts drift, maybe to the sound of violins on a Miami lawn, maybe to the screams in a Chicago alley, maybe to the silence of a brother who begged him to stop. We don't know, because he never said. Capone didn't leave memoirs. He left autopsies, ledgers, rumors, grainy photographs, where he smiles with men who died too soon and too violently. The story we know is pieced together, like a jigsaw puzzle soaked in blood. A smile at the courthouse steps, a smirk at a funeral, a hand raised in greeting or warning, and a cigar, always a cigar. But they never stayed lit for long, because kings, real kings, they burn bright, but never all the way down. Sometimes they fizzle in silence, sometimes they fall in courtrooms, and sometimes they just forget to light the match. There are places in cities, narrow, low-roofed, crisscrossed by steel and soot, where time moves differently. Brooklyn, 1903. Near the Navy Yard, freight trains roared just overhead, shaking the floorboards of the Capone apartment each time they passed. It was a sound you either grew used to, or were driven mad by a groan in the pipes, a tremble in the windows, a constant reminder that something heavier than you was always moving, always above the laundry lines, above the noise, above the little boy staring out the crack window watching soot settle on the street below. That boy was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. They called him Al. Born January 17th, 1899, the fourth of 9 children, to Gabrielle and Teresa Capone. Italian immigrants from Angri, south of Naples, Gabrielle worked as a barber. His hands always smelled faintly of lather and steel. Quiet, gentle, stoic, the kind of man who could hold a razor to a stranger's throat and not blink. Teresa was the opposite: loud, proud, quick to correct, fiercely Catholic. She believed in saints, boiling water, and backhands when the boys misbehaved. She carried herself like a woman who dared America to look down on her children and slapped the ones who did. Their apartment sat above the family barber shop on Navy Street. One window faced the yard where warships were born. The other faced a brick wall that never changed. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, the apartment smelled of garlic, wax polish, wet wool, and a century's worth of old steam. They were poor, but not pitiful. There was always food on the table. Pasta, bread, beans, always rosaries on the wall, always noise from the neighbors. Curses in Sicilian, prayers in Latin, sobs in English. Al grew up knowing 3 languages, one of survival, one of shame, and one of charm. But what he wanted most was more than the tight rooms, more than the Sunday sermons, more than the whispers from the men who stopped by the shop with envelopes, nods, and hands that never seemed to leave their coat pockets. By the time Al was 7, he'd learned to shine shoes. By 9, he was running errands for gamblers. By 11, he knew exactly which cops looked away for a nickel, and which demanded a dime. The streets were his classroom. School, real school, never suited him. He was too smart, too restless, too quick to talk back. At 14, he struck a teacher who called him Dago Trash. She slapped his face. He broke her nose. They expelled him before his shoes even touched the sidewalk. He never returned, not to a classroom, not to that version of himself. Al's education continued where rail lines crossed and boot heels cracked on cobblestone. The 5 Points Gang, the Navy Street Boys, the Junior 40 Thieves. Names more than gangs, but still deadly. In those early days he ran numbers, moved booze in baskets beneath fish, hauled crates for gamblers, picked up debts, dropped off warnings. He watched men shake hands while planning each other's funerals. He listened as shopkeepers called his mother a saint and his brothers thieves. He learned the real rules. Loyalty is currency. Silence is armor. Fear. Fear is everything. He was a stocky teenager, broad shoulders, square jaw, eyes that didn't flinch when men twice his age tried to stare him down. He didn't start fights, but he never walked away from one. By 15, his knuckles stayed red, and raw skin torn from too many nights proving his name. But he was learning fast how to smile while making a threat, how to read a man's eyes before he moved, how to hold his ground when others ran. And then, one night outside the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, Fate stepped forward in a clean white shirt and a thick Sicilian accent. Johnny Torrio, older, calm, calculated. He watched Al break up a dice game gone wrong, watched him settle a fight with a quiet word and a brutal backhand. And you'll wear silk before you're 20. He meant it. Torrio was a rising name in the underworld, respected, never loud. He ran gambling halls with clean floors and clean books. A businessman with a gangster's patience. He didn't need a hot-headed kid with scraped knuckles, but he saw something in Al, something sharp, something useful. And Al, for all his bravado, saw in Torrio the first man worth listening to. A mentor, a mirror, a map out of Brooklyn. By 17, Al was working nights at the Harvard Inn, bouncer, bartender, collector, whatever Torrio needed. He wore suspenders and boots with metal caps in the toes. He learned how to pour drinks, clean blood from tile, and talk drunk men into handing over their wallets without ever making them feel robbed. But he made mistakes. One of them would leave a mark that never faded. There was a girl, a loud laugh, a joke about her figure. Her brother didn't find it funny. He pulled a blade from his boot and carved 3 lines down Al's left cheek, from temple to jaw. The blood was fast and hot. Al didn't cry, didn't run. He covered the wound with a towel, spat onto the sidewalk, and kept pouring drinks. The scar healed, crooked, deep, pink, and the nickname followed. Scarface. He hated it. He told people it was from the war or a car crash or a fall through glass. Anything but the truth, because to Al, power meant control, and scars were weakness. But scars have a way of telling their own stories. By 19, He was tired of the small leagues. Torrio had moved west to Chicago. He sent word back. "The city's wide open," he wrote. "Plenty of meat. No kings." Capone packed a small suitcase, kissed his mother's hand, and boarded a train west. No ceremony, no fanfare, just steel tracks and dreams built from soot. Chicago was waiting, and so was history. In the years to come, people would say Capone's rise was sudden, explosive, like he came out of nowhere. But that wasn't true. The boy from Navy Street didn't stumble into crime. He studied it, lived it, learned its rhythm in the rattle of overhead trains and the sigh of pocket knives pulled too slow. His childhood wasn't an accident. It was a forge, and what came out of it was steel, sharp, cold, unforgiving, but shaped by fire. It happened on a summer night in 1917, the kind of night where the sidewalks of Coney Island still shimmer with the breath of the afternoon heat, where the sea air comes in thick with salt and fried clams, and where the moonlight doesn't so much shine. As Hayes, the Harvard Inn, stood at Surf Avenue and West 16th, a two-story saloon with swinging glass doors, mirrored walls, and a crowd that never asked questions it didn't want answered. Inside, the piano was out of tune, but playing anyway. Bottles clinked, laughter barked from the corners. The floor was slick with spilled beer and tobacco spit, and in the back room, behind a curtain, no one touched. Poker games ran until sunrise. Quiet but bloody, Alphonse Capone stood behind the bar that night. 18 years old, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, his hair slicked back like an old film actor, though the shine came from sweat more than pomade. He wore a rolled-up shirt, suspenders pulled tight, and a toothpick that shifted from corner to corner of his mouth like punctuation. He had already worked his way into Torrio's trust, though Torrio had moved his eyes westward. Al remained behind, watching, learning, collecting. He poured drinks and broke up fights and whispered promises that made even the older boys listen. And he had a habit, a flaw. Al liked the attention, and he liked women, especially ones that didn't belong to him. She was sitting alone that night. Red hair, ivory blouse, laughter like breaking glass. Al leaned across the bar, winked, and tossed a compliment dressed like an insult. Crude, loud, enough to turn heads. The woman flinched, but she didn't speak. Her brother did. He stepped forward, quiet, thin, hard-eyed. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. Just walked the short distance between his chair and Capone's corner of the bar, then reached beneath his coat. The blade was short, sharp, 3 slashes, fast, precise, from cheekbone to jawline. 1, 2, 3. Capone staggered backward, hand to his face. Blood bloomed between his fingers, warm, red, too much, too fast. Someone screamed. The piano stopped. The man with the knife didn't stay. He vanished into the night like a whisper, and no one followed, because by then everyone understood something. This was a message, not about the girl, about respect. Capone didn't collapse. He stood, tore off his undershirt, pressed it to his face, walked, not ran, to the kitchen sink, still bleeding, eyes furious, but silent. No one said a word to him. The cut was deep. They stitched it crooked, and it healed worse. 3 lines, angry and pink, carved into his left cheek. They pulled at his face when he smiled, made him look older, meaner. He told people it came from war, or a mugging, or nothing at all, but the truth stayed quiet, just like him. They started calling him Scarface. He hated the name. He would never use it himself, not in public, not in private. He made his men avoid it, made reporters regret it, but he couldn't unmake the face. And in time, he didn't need to, because the scar did something else. It made people remember. The boy who looked too young, too eager, too brash was gone. In his place stood a man with a face carved by consequence, and when he looked at you, it was the left side he turned, always the scarred side, like a challenge or a reminder. Torrio heard about the cut. He didn't laugh. He sent a letter, thin and typed, telling Al the time had come. "Chicago needs men with nerve," he wrote, "not boys who bleed in bars." There wasn't a train station grand enough for the dreams Al packed in that suitcase. He said goodbye to Brooklyn like a man walking out of his own skin. The Navy Yard, the cobblestones, his mother's prayers, the boys who still tossed dice in alleyways, all of it faded behind him as the train cut westward into the dark. He didn't look back because Brooklyn had made him what Chicago would make. His name, in 1919, the city greeted him not with glory, but with steam. Chicago was smoke, meat, grease, and thunder. The stockyards stretched like a wound across the south side, where thousands of animals met the knife each morning. The streets carried the smell. The people carried the sound. The wind whipped up blood and bourbon in equal parts, and beneath it, all under the storefronts and factories and respectable hats, was a hunger for money, for power, for drink. Prohibition had been signed into law that year. The 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, was enforcement. But what it really was opportunity. Bars shuttered, bottles vanished, but thirst? Thirst didn't die. It just got expensive. And in Chicago, expensive meant dangerous. Torrio welcomed Capone with a quiet nod and a corner office in a brothel fronting as a flower shop. It wasn't fancy, but it was his, and from there, Capone watched. He watched deals happen with a handshake and a shrug, watched cops walk out with bribes stuffed in their lunch sacks, watched voters turn out in droves. For the men Torrio paid to run, it was a machine, and Torrio kept it oiled. Capone started. Small, collecting, transporting, making sure a shipment of Canadian whiskey made it to Cicero without being hijacked, shaking hands with aldermen, memorizing which cops liked poker and which preferred cash. But unlike Brooklyn, Chicago didn't flinch. The violence was bigger here. Bodies didn't vanish. They were made public. Bullet-ridden sedans on quiet blocks, torched buildings, public threats, and Capone, scarred and silent, fit in, because here no one asked about your past, only your price. By 1920, Al had stopped sending letters home. He'd bought his first tailored suit, midnight gray with a navy pin, Italian wool. He wore it like armor. He dined at Colosimo's cafe, sat with men twice his age, and didn't speak unless asked. But they saw him. They saw the eyes, the stillness, the readiness to act. He didn't brag, didn't laugh loudly. He was a man built from two worlds, Brooklyn's blood, Chicago's appetite, and behind his back, some whispered about the scar, but never twice. He began carving his space, not with blades, but with precision. He understood something most men never did, that violence could be currency, but fear was capital. He paid well, but punished better. He was never the most brutal, never the smartest, but he was the one who remembered everything. The man who cut him in Coney Island? He was found years later in a Pennsylvania ditch. No one connected the dots, not publicly. But Capone didn't forget. Not the insult, not the pain, not the lesson. Somewhere along the tracks between Brooklyn and Chicago, the boy with fists became a man with memory, and for men like that, the city was ripe. Bootleggers rose, politicians folded, guns were bought by the crate, and Capone stood quietly in the corner of every deal. Not yet king, but already impossible to ignore. Years later, when reporters asked where the scar came from, he smiled. The left side of his face pulled tight, and he said, "You should see the other guy." But there was no other guy. Not anymore. Only him. Only the face that launched 1,000 headlines, that ruled a city, that shook hands with mayors, that stood trial for an empire, that scar, a relic of Brooklyn, had followed him, not as shame, but as prophecy, because in a city like Chicago, where ambition bled through the streets, a man didn't need a crown, he just needed a mark. It began with silence, not the absence of noise, but the absence of clinked glasses, the stillness of backroom pianos, the quiet grief of doors closed too early and bottles locked away. January, the United States officially went dry. The 18th Amendment had become law, and with it the Volstead Act carved into stone what most Americans already feared. The age of temperance had arrived, but in Chicago, that silence lasted only hours. By nightfall, men with hollow eyes and hard hands were already hauling barrels down alleys and behind butcher shops, casks disguised as flour sacks, bottles hidden beneath baby carriages, whiskey rerouted through Canada, gin cooked in basement stills that. Stank of metal and regret, the law had drawn a line, but men like Al Capone saw it not as a wall, but an invitation. Johnny Torrio had seen it coming. He laid the groundwork in Cicero, just outside the jurisdiction of the Chicago PD, gambling dens, prostitution houses, low-level enforcement, and political control, all in place and humming. But Torrio was cautious, careful, conservative. Capone wasn't. Where Torrio whispered, Al amplified. Where Torrio stayed behind the curtain, Capone walked onto the stage, and the city applauded. Capone took control with grace and violence. He didn't seize the empire all at once. He absorbed it, piece by piece. A rival's bootlegging operation in Little Italy absorbed a distillery in Southside that wouldn't pay tribute. Burned, then rebuilt, under new management. Capone spoke softly in meetings, courteous, clean-suited, sober, more often than not, but he never walked alone, and behind him, always just far enough to not appear obvious, were men like Jack, McGurn, and Frank Nitti, men who didn't speak unless it was with bullets. They carried Thompson submachine guns beneath long wool coats. They drove black Fords with stolen plates and short tempers. And Capone, he made himself untouchable. He wore pinstripe suits, stitched. In New York, two-tone shoes polished to a mirror shine, diamonds in his pinky ring, a pearl-handled revolver tucked in a custom holster beneath his vest. He'd bathed twice a day and kept his hair slicked like lacquered wood. But it wasn't vanity, it was armor. He understood the psychology of spectacle. To the public, he wasn't a criminal. He was royalty. His cars became symbols. The Cadillac he rode through Cicero was custom-built. Bulletproof glass, reinforced steel, plating, tires that could run on bare rims, the same model used by General Pershing during World War I. Capone wasn't at war, but he was preparing for one. By 1922, Chicago wasn't governed from City Hall. It was ruled from bar stools and booths, from speakeasy balconies and private cigar rooms behind storefronts that smelled of pine soap and bourbon. Capone's men controlled the docks, the breweries, the supply chains, the cops, the politicians, and slowly the narrative to the poor. He was a folk hero. He opened soup kitchens in the winter, serving hot meals to thousands, no questions asked. He paid rent for widows. He tipped waiters with $100 bills and told them to take the rest of the day off. He walked the sidewalks of South Side like a priest. Children ran to him, kissed his ring, clung to his sleeves. He gave them candy. He gave their fathers work. He gave the city stories to tell. But behind every smile was a record. Capone tracked every dollar, every man on payroll, every rival eliminated. Every barrel of beer accounted for. It wasn't just an empire, it was a machine, and it worked. By 1925, his operations were pulling in an estimated $100 million annually, equivalent to over $15 billion today. From Cicero to the Loop, From bootleg whiskey to brothels to betting houses, every dollar moved under his watch. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing. Left unpunished, he didn't scream when disrespected. He didn't threaten publicly. He would lean forward, tap an ash from his cigar, and say, "A man can do anything if he knows what people need." And then someone would disappear. Informants were found in alleys. Rivals were dragged from their cars on Michigan Avenue, one by one. The old bootleg kings fell. George Bugs, Moran, Dean O'Banion's crew, the remnants of the North Side Gang. Some disappeared into shallow graves on the edge of forest preserves. Others were found in cars, mouths stuffed with rags, bullet holes in the back of their heads. No charges, no trials, just headlines. Gangland slaying. Mob feud claims another. Violence rocked Chicago's underworld. But to Capone, it was logistics, a matter of flow, of order, of eliminating inefficiency. He didn't dwell on death, he dwelled on balance. For every life taken, another man got promoted. For every building burned, another rose in its place. Newer, cleaner, closer to City Hall. He made peace with the press. Reporters loved him. He gave quotes, smiled for photographs, bought lunch for whole newsrooms. They called him the Robin Hood of the Roaring Twenties. He let them because that's what he needed them to believe. He knew that in America, power wasn't about bullets. It was about myth, and he was writing his own. Inside the Lexington Hotel, he built his kingdom. Suite 443, 3 rooms, thick, carpet, phones in every corner, a private vault, and windows with a view of nothing. He lived like a prince, but never let the walls feel too permanent. He moved often, slept in different beds, carried a revolver in his robe pocket. He wasn't paranoid, just careful, because he knew how many men were counting the seconds until he slipped. He held lavish dinners, but ate alone when it mattered. He danced with actresses, but kept his wife and son hidden behind gates. He toasted to peace, but always had a backup plan. He was the smiling face of Chicago's underworld, but behind the teeth was a man who remembered every betrayal he'd ever tasted. By 1926, Capone's reach extended beyond Chicago. He held influence in Florida, New York, Detroit. He brokered deals with Irish gangs, paid tribute to Sicilian dons, maintained neutrality. In City Hall elections, unless he wanted a candidate gone, he wasn't just rich, he was untouchable, and the city let him be, because for all the blood he spilled, he brought stability. Other gangs dissolved in chaos. Capone's kept order. Rules, structure, hierarchy, men knew their place. And in a city drowning in corruption and poverty that counted for something, but there were cracks, always cracks. The violence was too visible. The newspapers, once friendly, started asking harder questions. Who killed O'Banion? Where was Jaime Weiss? Why did half the police force retire early with summer homes? Capone deflected with charm. He hosted charity events, donated to churches, sat beside aldermen at public functions, smiling beneath a cream fedora, like a man with nothing to hide. But in private, he doubled down. He moved shipments faster, expanded. Operations into Cicero's municipal government bought silence with cash and fear. His accountants expanded. His hitmen aged into legend. Jack McGurn, Tony Accardo, the Gusenberg brothers, names whispered like folklore. And Al, at the center of it all, watched with quiet calculation. His temper, when it came, was brief but volcanic. One of his own men, a low-level enforcer, once skimmed from a payout. Capone called him in, sat him down, poured him a drink, then beat him to death with a baseball bat while the others watched, stunned. Silent when it was done, Capone lit a cigar, took a slow drag, and said, "This is what happens when family forgets its manners." Even loyalty had to be taught, and fear was the chalk he wrote with. But there was another side. one no photo ever caught. The boy from Brooklyn, still somewhere beneath the pinstripes and cigars, a man who paced alone at night, who sent money home to his mother every month, who held his son's hand like it might disappear. He had built an empire on crime, but he believed, truly, that he was bringing order, structure, in his own way. Justice, because in a world where the law was for sale, wasn't it better to buy it? By 1927, Capone had become legend, not just in Chicago, but across the country. Children dressed like him on Halloween. His suits were copied, his quotes reprinted. He was admired, envied, feared, but he was also marked. The IRS had begun whispering, federal agents scribbling numbers in notebooks, watching the cars, the shipments, the luxury. They didn't need to prove murder. They only needed math, but for now, in this moment, Capone stood untouched, at the top of his world, a glass of bourbon in one hand, a lead ledger open on the desk. Before him, Chicago at his feet, and the city lights outside blinking like fireflies. As if they belonged to him, it was said only half-jokingly that in 1920s Chicago, the only way to get elected was to shake Capone's hand. Or fear it, the handshake was easier. By the mid-20s, the city was no longer a chessboard. It was a mechanism, a humming, clicking, smoke-spewing contraption of gears and levers, all grinding toward profit, toward power, toward the illusion of order. And at its center wasn't a mayor, or a councilman, or a judge. It was Al Capone. He didn't hold office. He didn't need to, because Capone didn't campaign. He appointed. In the 1924 Cicero municipal election, Capone's men walked voters to the polls, sometimes at gunpoint. They broke into opposition headquarters and threw ballot boxes into the river. They beat precinct captains in front of their families. That year, every one of Capone's candidates won. When reporters asked about it, Capone smiled. "We support good government," he said, "always have." That phrase, good government, became a punchline in the neighborhoods that knew better. It meant loyalty, obedience, silence. He kept lists. He kept ledgers. He knew which police captains liked cigars and which preferred girls. He knew which aldermen needed campaign funds and which needed a quiet threat. A man might walk into City Hall with ambition, but by lunchtime, it belonged to Capone. It was elegant in its simplicity. Want your sidewalk repaired? Call Capone. Want the local beat cop to leave your numbers game alone? Capone. Want to sell liquor out the back door of your restaurant without worry? Capone. He offered services the city had stopped providing: safety, access, predictability. He greased the wheels that Chicago had let rust. To many, it felt less like a mob and more like government reimagined, and that was the danger. The machine worked because it wasn't hidden. Capone didn't wear masks. He attended public functions, posed for photographs, donated to charities, sat ringside at boxing matches, and clapped along with the crowd at church fundraisers. He handed priests envelopes so thick they cracked the collection tray. At weddings, he gave fathers gold watches with initials engraved beneath the clasp. And at funerals, he arrived last, solemn, silent, in a black three-piece, and left early before the cameras could get too close. He made the newspaper's front page often, sometimes in articles that read like press releases, other times not, because not everyone bent. Some reporters refused to play along. Frank Loesch, a criminal reformer and president of the Chicago Crime Commission, began compiling lists, names, dates, murders unsolved. One name at the top, Capone's, Paul Gallico. Of the New York Daily News, wrote columns that cut through the myth like piano wire. The face of the city is a scar. He wrote, and its name is Al. Reformers began to march. The Women's Christian Temperance Union staged parades. Churches lit candles for the lost sons and daughters who vanished into speakeasies and alleys and never came back. And federal agents like Elliot Ness began to take notes. But Capone didn't worry because the machine still turned, because money still moved, because politicians still picked up the phone when he called and didn't speak until he told them they could. In 1926, Mayor William Big Bill Thompson, a political opportunist with a cowboy hat and a slippery handshake, made a deal. Capone would fund the campaign. In return, Thompson would keep law enforcement focused on anything but organized crime. They didn't meet in back alleys. They met in clubs over steak, over brandy, one man hungry for votes, the other for insurance. They both walked away smiling, and in return, Capone got what he needed. Time, Chicago police raided saloons, but not Capone's. They arrested low-level bootleggers, but never the trucks bearing Capone's initials. Judges found technicalities. Cases disappeared. Witnesses recanted. And the city went on breathing, like a man who knew he was sick, but didn't want the diagnosis. But power breeds visibility, and visibility breeds enemies. And Capone was everywhere. When he attended the Dempsey-Tunney fight in Philadelphia, newspapers followed his every step. When he appeared in Florida at a real estate deal, reporters tracked him like royalty. He played the part, wore white suits, flashed smiles, tipped generously, but behind the curtain, the empire was bleeding. Rival gangs plotted in silence. Informants began talking to anyone who offered immunity, and the public's affection, once so easily bought, began to sour. The murder of William McSwiggan, a state prosecutor, in 1926 shocked the city. He had been drinking with Capone men, then riddled with bullets in a quiet suburb. The hypocrisy stung, and Capone knew it. He retreated, briefly, to his estate in Miami, where palms rustled instead of sirens. He tried to live clean, eat soft meals, walk in the garden, but Chicago wasn't done with him, and neither was the federal government. Because while Capone had bribed the city into silence, Washington had been listening, not to gunshots, but to pages, files, receipts, ledgers that Internal Revenue Service, laughed at by most gangsters, had begun a quiet campaign. They weren't chasing murder, they were chasing margins. If they couldn't catch Capone with a gun in his hand, they'd catch him with an unpaid invoice. Frank Wilson was an accountant with a dull face and a quiet voice. He didn't carry a badge, but he carried patience. He began gathering records, comparing statements, tracking bank movements. Capone spent lavishly, owned property, tipped outrageously, but he claimed no income to Wilson. That wasn't arrogance, it was opportunity. He found discrepancies in real estate, in checks, in whispers from disgruntled bookkeepers. The case began to build, not as a thunderclap, but as a low rising tide, and Capone didn't see it coming. He still believed in charm, in handshakes, in charity. He threw lavish parties for city officials, funded boxing events with proceeds going to local hospitals, gave interviews where he called himself just a businessman. "I give the people what they want," he said. "They want a drink, a laugh, a safe place to enjoy life. I just fill the need." It sounded reasonable, even patriotic, but beneath that voice, warm, confident, measured, was a man being hunted, not by bullets, but by decimal points. In 1929, the machine stalled, not collapsed, but sputtered. The Valentine's Day Massacre tore through the press like a fever. 7 men shot execution style in a garage on North Clark Street. Capone wasn't even in town, but the public didn't care. The myth of the benevolent bootlegger cracked. Suddenly, the soup kitchens couldn't wash the blood away. Photographers stopped cropping the bodies out of the frame. The headlines changed. Mob butcher rules Chicago. Capone empire built. On corpses, who will stop him? Capone tried to control the narrative. He gave more, smiled wider, donated larger sums, but it was too late, because his machine was now feeding itself, and it had found something tastier than power: punishment. By 1930, a federal task force was fully assembled, silent, tireless. They weren't trying to catch him holding a weapon. They were trying to prove he paid for them, that the guns were tax deductible, that the bribes were bonuses, that the empire had invoices, Capone's. Accountants were followed. One by one they were questioned. Some folded, some disappeared. One, a nervous man with a child on the way, handed over ledgers that would later become Exhibit A. Capone laughed when he heard. "Let them try," he said. "They can't prove anything." But this time it wasn't about proving what he did. It was about proving what he didn't. He didn't file, he didn't report, he didn't pay. And in America, that was unforgivable. The mayor still took his calls. The alderman still smiled, but the air was different now. Capone wasn't a king. He was a liability, a ghost in the machinery, something the city wished it could forget, but couldn't afford to. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Capone never flinched in public. He dressed sharply, dined publicly, tipped as always, but in private, he paced. He smoked faster, he questioned loyalties, he moved beds. He carried 2 pistols, one in each pocket, even in his own hotel suite, not because he expected betrayal, but because he finally understood. He was no longer the machine. He was the jam in the gears, the threat to the very thing he'd built. And the government, slow, clumsy, deliberate, had learned his game. They were no longer chasing shadows. They were counting coins. February 14th, 1929. The wind had sharpened overnight. It moved through the alleys of North Clark Street like a knife dry, bitter and mean, the kind of cold that turned steam into silence and made footsteps sound like gunfire on the frozen pavement. The garage sat at 2122 North Clark, a low-slung brick building tucked behind a narrow gravel lot. It belonged to George Buggs, Warren's North Side gang, a crew of Irish toughs who had bled too long, too loudly, against the rising tide of Capone's empire. Inside the garage, 7 men waited: Frank and Peter Gusenberg, Albert Kachalik, Adam Heyer, Reinhard Schwimmer, Albert Weinshank, and John May, the mechanic, who just wanted to fix cars and get home to his dog. They stood near the rear wall, backs to the brick, hands in pockets. Some smoked, others paced. They were told a shipment of whiskey was coming, that it was big, that it would tip the scales. It was a lie. At 10:30 a.m., a police car pulled up outside the garage. Not unusual in those days. Sometimes real, sometimes not. 2 men in uniform stepped out, 2 more in plain clothes behind them. Calm, efficient. They moved through the snow without urgency. Inside the garage, no one ran, because who runs from the police? The uniforms entered first. They barked orders. The 7 men raised their hands and turned toward the wall, still calm, still expecting some routine shakedown. And then the silence split. Tommy guns, short bursts, then long ones, then the thunder of revolvers behind them. The men fell fast, collapsing like dominoes in slow motion. Blood hit the concrete. Coats twisted around dying limbs. One of them twitched for almost a full minute before he stopped moving. 70 rounds spent in seconds. The shooters walked out just as calmly as they'd come. Neighbors saw them leave too, in police uniforms, escorting the others with fake handcuffs. Like an arrest, nobody stopped them. Nobody ever did. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 bodies, 4 Thompson submachine guns. 0 arrests, no convictions. And behind it all, nothing solid. Just smoke, just suggestion, just a name whispered. In rooms where men lit cigarettes with trembling hands, Capone. But Capone wasn't in Chicago. He was in Florida, at his estate on Palm Island. The sun was warm, the grass clipped, the fountains gently burbled, the orchids were in bloom, and the air smelled of citrus. He spent the day playing cards, ate lunch by the water, told jokes to guests beneath striped umbrellas. When a reporter called for comment, Capone chuckled. "You know me," he said. "I don't shoot nobody. I'm just a businessman." But no one believed him. And maybe that was the point. The massacre wasn't just a killing. It was theater. It was spectacle. It was strategy as performance. Because Bugs Moran had pushed too far. He'd hijacked Capone's shipments, shot his men, mocked him in taverns. And Capone didn't forgive public insult. Moran should have been there that day. He was the target. But he overslept. He arrived late, saw the police car out front, turned, and walked away. He lived, but 7 of his men didn't. And no one ever dared mock Capone in public again. The press erupted. Massacre in Chicago. Gangland war reaches new peak. Who rules this city, the mayor or Capone? Even loyal editors struggled to spin it. The public, once dazzled by Capone's charity and charm, began to shiver beneath the warmth. The man who tipped waiters and fed the poor had unleashed a brutality that no soup kitchen could cover. Fear shifted. It no longer felt protective, it felt predatory. Church groups demanded action. Civic leagues shouted into microphones. Politicians, once eager for Capone's money, now crossed the street when they saw his men. Capone watched it all with a soft, sardonic smile. He still dressed immaculately, still gave to orphans, still posed for the cameras with a cigarette dangling from his lips and a diamond pin on his lapel. But behind his eyes, something changed. There was no more pretending. The world had stopped seeing him as Robin Hood. Now they saw what had always been there, a ruler with no crown and no conscience. A garage floor on North Clark was hosed down, but the blood never really left. Photographs of the scene flooded newsstands, grainy, horrific, unforgettable. Men twisted in unnatural shapes, hats half off their heads, hands reaching towards something that was never coming. The violence wasn't just brutal, it was surgical. It was too much, and that was the point. Capone wasn't just eliminating rivals, he was issuing a proclamation. I decide who gets to breathe. For the first time, Washington took notice. J. Edgar Hoover, still building his bureau, used the massacre as a rallying cry. The image of Chicago as a lawless jungle became politically useful. Federal money was allocated, special units formed, and slowly the focus shifted, not on the guns, but on the books, because men like Capone didn't leave trails of bodies alone. They left ledgers, receipts, taxes unpaid. The massacre didn't just kill 7 men. It awakened the machine that would eventually take Capone down. Capone returned to Chicago weeks later. He gave an interview on the train, smiled for the press, told a joke about the weather, but something about him had dulled. Not his clothing, not his confidence, but his sense of safety. He had crossed a line, one even the crooked system couldn't fully excuse. He had made Chicago bleed in broad daylight, and the city, no matter how many favors he'd bought, was starting to recoil from that day forward. Every movement was watched. The phone lines clicked. The federal task force grew teeth. Even his own men began to wonder, how long can a king hold court when the crowd has turned? Capone would go on smiling for a little while longer, but behind every smile now was the echo of gunfire on Clark Street and the knowledge that the war he'd won in blood might cost him the empire he'd built in gold. Palm Island was supposed to be peace, 20 minutes from downtown Miami, surrounded by the still water of Biscayne Bay, connected by a narrow causeway lined with swaying palms and stucco homes that shimmered like postcards in the sun. In 1928, Al Capone bought the mansion there for $40,000. Spanish colonial, white stone walls, red tile roof, marble floors so polished they reflected the clouds through the windows. The estate came with imported orchids, a saltwater pool, and a view that stretched wide across the bay like a promise. But Capone didn't come for the view, he came for escape. By then, Chicago had grown colder, not just in weather, but in temperature toward its king. After the street Valentine's Day Massacre, his name no longer drew admiration, it drew tension. Curled lips, furtive glances, doors that used to open were now unlocked more slowly. Capone had always known when to withdraw, not out of fear, but to preserve the illusion. He told reporters he was taking time for his health. He told associates he was expanding operations, but privately, he was running out of room to breathe. In Florida, things were different. The light fell softly on his face. The wind smelled of ocean and oranges. His wife, May, stayed quietly in the shadows of the house. His son, Sonny, visited occasionally, smiling in photographs but leaving soon after. Capone filled the estate with guards, not bodyguards, soldiers, men with rifles, dogs, and radios. The front gates were manned 24 hours a day. His windows were double glazed, the hedges trimmed low so no one could hide behind them. He had phones installed in every major room, 6 lines in total, all with different functions, none trusted completely. He paid off the Miami mayor, local detectives, even state legislators, and yet he couldn't sleep. Each night, he'd step onto the upper balcony in a cream robe, slippers, a silk cigar in hand. He would stare out over the black mirror of the bay, where the lights of fishing boats blinked like distant stars, and wonder which one carried a man set to kill him, because by now Capone didn't believe in safety, only delay. His health began to change. The headaches came first, then the bouts of confusion, forgetting names, repeating phrases, locking himself in rooms and accusing the help of plotting against him. He'd sit for hours in his study, the blinds drawn, rereading old ledgers from the Chicago days, the ones he refused to burn. Not because he needed the records, but because they reminded him that he once had control. He stopped trusting even his closest men, Frank Nitti, Tony Accardo, Jake Guzik, names once etched into his foundation. Now suspects. He changed locks weekly, moved bedrooms monthly, told his guards to rotate shifts without notice, not for efficiency, but to keep anyone from memorizing a pattern. There were nights he slept with a gun beneath the pillow, others where he didn't sleep at all. He kept a bottle of tonic water by the bed and a .38 snub-nose on the knit-stand. The orchids near the window, once fragrant and delicate, began to wilt. Unwatered, forgotten, Capone paced the hallways, barefoot, listening to the echo of his own steps on the marble. Sometimes he stopped, turned, as if hearing something behind him, but there was never anyone there. In public, he was still. Big Al. He'd posed for photographs near the mansion gate, wore white linen suits, straw hats, and gold cufflinks. He'd tip the ice cream man a $20 bill, wave to tourists, toss coins into fountains with a smile like nothing had ever changed. But locals began to notice the eyes darker now, the smile shorter, the walk slower. He no longer drove himself. He no longer laughed loudly, and when children asked for autographs, he'd often turn away, muttering something no one could understand. Back in Chicago, the operation continued. Barely. Frank Nitti tried to keep the books balanced. Ralph Capone handled the breweries. Jack McGurn tightened the gambling rackets. But the glue that had held it all together, the sheer force of Capone's personality, was gone. Meetings that once ended with decisive action now ended with arguments. Payments were missed, messages delayed, territories slipped. And into that vacuum crept something worse than the law: ambition. Whispers began to circulate that Capone had lost his edge, that he had become soft, paranoid, sick, that maybe the boss wasn't coming back. Capone heard them, not directly, but in the spaces between phone calls and the shifts in tone from men he'd once raised up. Even in paradise, betrayal had a way of riding the wind. He tightened his circle further. He stopped answering calls unless they came through a specific line with a specific knock on the wire, 3 short, 1 long. Anyone who failed the code was cut off. Permanently, in private moments, he returned to the poolside, not to swim, but to sit. He would lower himself into a lounge chair, shirt open to the sun. The scar on his left cheek now faded, but still visible beneath the stubble. He stared into the water, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. The men around him waited in silence, watching a man who once controlled a city, now unsure of what day it was. He would speak suddenly. "They're lying to me, Frank. They're all in on it. Even Ralph." Then silence again, then sleep, and when he woke, he had no memory of what he'd said. The doctors were vague. Tertiary syphilis, neurological decline, possible dementia. They prescribed tonics. Rest, more sun, less stress. But there was no medicine for regret. No pill that erased the weight of a dozen dead friends, or the paranoia that grows when you build an empire on fear. Capone didn't mourn what he'd done, but he feared what might be done to him, because when you live by control, its absence is more terrifying than any bullet. One morning in early 1930, Capone was found slumped in the Orchid Room, a place he rarely entered anymore. The staff had ignored his instructions and left a pitcher of water on the desk, just in case he hadn't moved in hours. When they woke him, he asked what city they were in. When they said Miami, he smiled. "Thought we were in Havana," he whispered. And then, "Where's Johnny?" Torrio had retired years ago. Capone had not seen him in nearly a decade. The estate slowly grew quieter. Guests stopped coming. The laughter faded. The guards spoke in whispers now, uncertain who they were protecting, or from what. Capone remained on the balcony, or in his office, or sometimes on the dock, staring into the water like it might finally answer the question that had haunted him since he left Chicago. "Who still believes in me?" There was no reply, only the sound of waves, the rustle of orchids in the breeze, and the slow unraveling of a man who once made a city bow, now afraid of his own reflection. It wasn't the Thompson guns that brought Al Capone down. It wasn't the enemies he made, or the blood spilled in garages and alleys. It wasn't the street battles or the rival gangs or even the parade of bodies laid out like warning signs across Chicago. What undid him was math in a cramped, unremarkable office inside the U.S. Treasury Department. A man sat quietly under the dim hum of a single desk lamp. His name was Frank Wilson. He didn't carry a badge. He didn't shout. He didn't care much for headlines. But he believed in numbers. He believed in the paper trail. And he believed that even the most powerful man in America's underworld couldn't spend $100,000 a year on suits and cigars without leaving fingerprints on a ledger. Wilson had been assigned to the Capone case as part of a special task force under the Bureau of Internal Revenue. It was 1930. By then, Capone was untouchable in every way that mattered, socially, politically, criminally. Every murder charge died on the witness stand. Every extortion case crumbled before it ever reached a jury. But Wilson wasn't after murder. He was after taxable income. He started small, examining restaurant bills, cross-referencing real estate transactions, following rumors whispered by former accountants, looking into shell companies that had no employees but steady income. The math didn't lie. Capone had declared almost nothing in earnings over the past 5 years, yet he lived like royalty. Chauffeurs, diamond rings, private rail cars, armored Cadillacs, multi-million-dollar bootlegging networks that stretched from Chicago to the Gulf of Mexico, and yet no income. It didn't add up, which meant something was being hidden, and Wilson had time. His method was quiet, painstaking. Months spent combing through ledgers seized from Capone-owned businesses, nightclubs, betting parlors, laundries, brothels. He developed a system, code names cross-referenced with aliases, patterns of cash movement, missing invoice numbers, hidden bank accounts, and then a breakthrough, a small, overlooked book recovered from a low-level collector during a raid on a Cicero gambling den. The bookkeeper hadn't resisted arrest, but he'd asked, pointedly, for protection in exchange for cooperation. Inside that notebook was a handwritten ledger, names, amounts, percentages, and dates. The handwriting was hesitant, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't gambling profit, this was income. And the percentages, they all pointed upward to the man at the top. Capone. The government couldn't tie him to a bullet, but they could now tie him to a profit. Wilson moved slowly. He needed more than one ledger. He needed corroboration, so he widened the net. He sent agents to banks, not for withdrawals, but for deposit slips. He checked the names of Capone's family, looked for inconsistencies, found them, lots of them. A cousin with no job had 5 accounts. A laundress who paid cash for a 3-story apartment. A driver who owned 2 boats, both unnamed, both tied to unregistered docks in Indiana. Each thread led to a knot, and Wilson pulled gently, persistently, until the entire weave began to fray. Meanwhile, Capone remained in Miami. He'd heard about the accountants, dismissed them. Let 'em count beans, he said. They'll choke on the soup. But he was wrong, because while his empire had been built with guns and charm, it was funded with cash, and cash always leaves a shadow. The indictment came in. June 1931, 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. Wilson's work had landed, not with a bang, but with the metallic snap of a manila folder landing on a federal judge's desk. Capone's attorneys scrambled. They tried to negotiate, offered fines, community work, even a self-imposed exile from Chicago, but the government had found its path. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about precedent. Capone would be made into a lesson. The trial opened in October. Capone arrived at the courthouse wearing a tailored gray suit, polished shoes, and a confident smile. He shook hands, waved to reporters, joked with the guards, but inside, the courtroom felt different than any he'd stood in before. There were no backroom favors, no corrupt judges, no witnesses who could be scared off. This wasn't about stories. It was about subtraction. Wilson sat silently behind the prosecutors. He didn't testify at first. He watched. Let the lawyers present the numbers. Unexplained income, conflicting records, statements of assets that couldn't be accounted for. Then, when the foundation had been laid, he took the stand, and he laid it bare with calm, deliberate speech. Wilson explained the trail. $32,000 in 1 year. Unreported $45,000 in casino kickbacks. $100,000 from alcohol shipments routed through Cicero. The jury sat motionless, no drama, no gasps, just the cold, clean lines of undeniable arithmetic. Capone's lawyers tried to pivot. They argued he couldn't read or write well, that he didn't manage his own affairs, that his name was being used without his knowledge, but the ledgers didn't lie, and Wilson, with his quiet, unshakable demeanor, had turned the gangster myth into a spreadsheet of fraud. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came. Guilty, Capone was convicted on 5 of the counts. The courtroom was still. Capone didn't speak. He sat, stone-faced, while the words settled around him like dust in sunlight. He was sentenced to 11 years. In federal prison, a fine of $50,000, court costs, and for the first time in his life, a number, not a name. He was stunned, not at the time, not at the sentence, but at the reality that the thing he'd built with charisma and cruelty had been undone by decimal points. Frank Wilson didn't celebrate. He packed his notes, filed his records, went home to his family, to his quiet life. He never sought glory, because men like Wilson understood something Capone never did. Power isn't what you wear, it's what you can prove. And when the proof is ink on paper, no fortress, no bodyguard, no reputation can protect you from it. The empire hadn't fallen in a shootout. It hadn't burned. It had crumbled, page by page, led by a man with a ledger and a courtroom full of silence. They took him in a gray federal car. No press, no crowd, no waving, handkerchiefs or reporters shouting his name. Just a long drive through rain-slick streets, past corners he used to own, toward a train that would carry him not to a mansion or a courtroom, but to a concrete cage. October 1931, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, federal prisoner, sentence. 11 years. They stripped his name, gave him a number, a Z85, incarcerated first at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, then transferred in 1934 to the new federal fortress rising out of the cold Pacific. Alcatraz Island, a rock with no edges, just walls, sea, and silence. Alcatraz didn't care who you were, not politicians, not bank robbers, not even the man who once ran the most powerful crime syndicate in the United States on Alcatraz. Everyone woke at 6:30 a.m. Everyone stood for count. Everyone scrubbed their own cell. Capone had no private phone lines, no guards on his payroll, no meals from personal chefs, just steel bars, scratchy uniforms, and the rhythmic slam of doors locking in unison. The cell was 5 feet wide, 7 feet long, a steel cot, a sink, a shelf, a toilet that hissed at night. His hands, once manicured, now cracked from soap and lime water, his suits replaced by stiff denim, his shoes by state-issued boots with worn rubber soles that squeaked on wet concrete. He kept his head down, spoke little, tried to adapt. But Alcatraz didn't let you forget who you were or who you used to be. He started work in the laundry, sorting, folding, pressing shirts for men who didn't know his name, only his number. Later, he was moved to the mop detail. He cleaned the main corridor known as Broadway, pushing a squeaky-wheeled bucket past the cells of murderers, extortionists, anarchists, some. Inmates whispered when he passed. Others just stared. A few spat on the floor in front of him. Capone said nothing. He just kept mopping. There were no visitors except his lawyers and May, who arrived once every few months with red-rimmed eyes and polite silence. She'd brought him letters, small tins of coffee, hand-sewn handkerchiefs. He called her Mama in front of the guards. Sometimes he didn't recognize her. The symptoms had begun in Atlanta. Subtle at first, headaches, slurred words, moments of confusion that passed like summer storms. But Alcatraz made them worse. The syphilis he'd carried untreated since his 20s was now eating through his brain. He repeated stories, forgot the names of guards he saw daily. Once he tried to bribe a warden who'd retired 2 years earlier. Another time, he asked a fellow inmate, Machine Gun Kelly, if he still ran the loop. Kelly just laughed, not kindly. Capone was moved off mop duty, reassigned to the prison band. He played banjo, not well, but earnestly. They called themselves the Rock Islanders once. A week they played in the mess hall simple tunes. No lyrics, just sound to break the silence. Capone sat in the corner, plucked gently, sometimes offbeat, sometimes not at all, but he smiled when the guards applauded, because it reminded him, faintly, misspelled words, nonsense phrases, entire pages devoted to lists of numbers that didn't mean anything. "I saw Johnny," he wrote once. "He told me to fix the garage, tell Frank the orchids are wet." May kept them, every one, folded and pressed between pages of her Bible, because even if he was gone, he was still hers. The other prisoners didn't fear him. They pitied him. The king had become a ghost, a quiet figure in the hallway, a man who asked about meals 3 times a day, a man who sometimes wept in his cell after night count, thinking no one could hear, but they could. Alcatraz didn't leave room for secrets. In 1938, after nearly 4 years on the Rock, Capone was deemed mentally unfit for continued incarceration there. He was transferred to Terminal Island Prison in California, then eventually to a hospital in Baltimore. By then the decline was obvious. He walked with a limp. His speech was slow, sometimes childlike at times. He mistook nurses for his mother. He asked for his old driver, asked about a restaurant that had burned down a decade before. He no longer knew who ran Chicago because Chicago had moved on, and so had the world. He was released in 1939 for time served. Technically a free man, but he was not free. He returned to Palm Island in Florida, where his mansion stood like a mausoleum to a life that no longer existed. He spent his days fishing in shallow water, staring blankly at old photo albums, and feeding ducks by hand. Once, he walked out into the yard in his slippers, naked, shouting orders to men who weren't there when his doctor found him. He was sobbing, not for what he'd lost, but because he didn't know what day it was. Even the government stopped watching him, because what threat could he pose now? The man who once balanced bribes, bullets, and citywood control could no longer tie his shoes. He died on January 25, 1947, in his bedroom at Palm Island. A heart attack. May was there, so was his doctor. He was 48 years old. The newspapers ran obituaries that read like closing arguments. Some praised his generosity, others condemned his crimes, but all agreed Al Capone, once the most feared man in America, had died broken, in body, in mind, in legacy. And back at Alcatraz, no ceremony was held, just a passing nod from the few guards who still remembered the man who mopped Broadway with a quiet stare, a man whose name once owned headlines, now reduced to a ghost on the roster, because Alcatraz never forgets, it just waits. The sun was warm on January 6, 1939, but the air inside the car was still. Alphonse Gabriel Capone sat in the back seat with his hands folded in his lap. He wore a rumpled beige suit, a soft felt hat, and shoes a size too large. He didn't speak during the ride. He didn't wave when they passed people on the sidewalks. He just looked out the window with the blank, drifting gaze of a man seeing things no one else could. After 7 years behind bars, Atlanta, then Alcatraz, then Terminal Island, Capone was technically free. But freedom is a word that demands memory, and Capone's memory was fractured beyond repair. When the car pulled up to the Palm Island estate, the guards stepped forward out of habit. They opened the gates slowly, as if waiting for something grander to pass through, but there was no grand entrance, no king returning to his castle, just a sick man returning to a house that had been waiting too long in silence. The mansion was still beautiful. Spanish colonial arches, marble floors, imported orchids wilting in clay pots near the veranda, the fountain in the courtyard still burbled faintly. Though the water pressure had weakened, the windows still caught the afternoon light. The hedges were still trimmed, but only just. Some were starting to brown at the edges. The walls remembered, but the man who walked through the door did not. He moved slowly, as if afraid the furniture might not recognize him. May greeted him at the door. Her smile was patient. Her hands trembled. She had aged without him, though he had aged faster. Capone didn't hug her. He looked past her, into the hallway, then turned to the butler and asked where the piano was. There had never been a piano. May led him to his room. It was cool and clean. A breeze moved the curtains. The bed had fresh sheets. He stood in the doorway for nearly a minute before stepping inside. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in a wooden chair near the window and watched the bay. From that night forward, the window became his clock. The neighbors learned quickly that he was back, but there were no celebrations, no city parades, no reporters lining the street, only the occasional visitor from the past men, who once feared him, now speaking in hushed tones with bowed heads and briefcases they left unopened. Most never came back because the man inside the house didn't recognize them. He would nod, smile faintly, ask about events that had never happened, refer to deals never made, repeat stories half remembered and half invented. He talked to shadows. In the corner of the room, he asked where Johnny was, told Frank not to forget the payment. One afternoon, he wandered down to the dock in his slippers and asked the gardener how many barrels of beer had come in that morning. The gardener, stunned, told him, "None, Mr. Capone." Capone frowned, turned, and said, "Well, tell them to unload it before dark." The house began to echo, not with music or conversation, but with footsteps, Capone's. He paced in wide, looping circuits, from the dining room to the veranda, from the garden to the empty garage. Sometimes he muttered to himself, other times he hummed songs no one recognized. He would pause in front of framed photographs of his son, of his wedding day, of old Chicago newspaper clippings, and stare for long stretches. Once he pulled a photo from the wall, turned it face down, and whispered, "Don't let him see me." May asked who. Capone just shook his head. He fished most mornings, not for sport, not for sustenance, just to sit with the rod in his hand, staring out at the bay. He rarely baited the hook, and he never brought anything back. But he'd return in the afternoons with his sleeves rolled, his face sunburned, and the satisfied look of a man who believed deeply that he'd done something important. Sometimes he asked for dinner. Sometimes he forgot he'd eaten. Sometimes he forgot what day it was. May tried to keep things normal. She played records in the living room. She read aloud from the newspaper. She walked with him in the gardens, arm in arm, talking about anything that might reach him: flowers, memories, food, silence. Occasionally he was clear. Once he pointed at a photograph of his son and said, "I was going to give him everything, the city, the racket, but he didn't want it." Another time at the dinner table, he looked up mid-bite and whispered, "Do they still remember me?" May set her fork down. "They remember?" she said softly. He nodded, but didn't ask again. The FBI no longer watched the house. There was no need. The man inside was no longer a threat to anyone, not even himself. He could barely hold a pen. He tried writing once. May found the paper on his desk the next morning. It was filled with numbers, repeated sequences, scribbles, the word Cicero written 9 times in a row at the bottom in shaky letters. "Tell Johnny it's all there." He grew slower as the months passed. His walk shortened, his appetite dimmed, his eyes, once sharp and calculating, now moved like a man trying to remember the name of the street he grew up on. He rarely left the house. When he did, it was to sit on the back patio, wrapped in a blanket, watching the wind pass through the palms. The guards were dismissed. There was no one left to protect him from. The staff remained quiet and distant. They had learned when he stared too long, it was best to say nothing. One evening, a nurse brought him his medicine. He looked at her and asked if she was his mother. She said no. He nodded. Ben asked her again. 5 minutes later, the mansion had once been a fortress. Now it was a tomb, not of violence, but of memory. The ghosts that haunted Capone weren't the men he'd killed. They were the names he'd forgotten. He no longer recalled the streets of Chicago. He no longer remembered who he had been afraid of, or who had been afraid of him. He only remembered feelings: a woman's perfume, the warmth of a piano, the cold of steel bars, and the endless salt-soaked silence of Biscayne Bay. January 25th, 1947. The doctor was called just after dawn. Capone had suffered a stroke 4 days earlier, then pneumonia. Then a final wave of silence that wouldn't lift. May held his hand. He was unconscious for most of it, but for a moment, just one, he opened his eyes. He looked toward the window and smiled, not at her, not at anyone, just at the light he died at. 7:25 a.m. No guards, no empire, no kingdom to fall, just the soft breath of waves outside, and a house that had waited too long for its king to remember why he built it. The wind that morning was softer than usual. Palm trees barely stirred. The water along Biscayne Bay rolled with a hush, gentle and gray beneath the overcast sky. The birds, so loud most mornings, were quiet, as if they, too, were waiting. Inside the white stone mansion on Palm Island, in the corner room that once faced the rising sun, a man lay still. January 25th, 1947. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, 48. Years old, once called king, once called monster. Now, just a man, barely breathing. He had been fading for days. The stroke came first silent and fast, robbing him of strength and speech, then retreating just long enough to let him know what it had taken. Then came pneumonia, the final visitor, May, sat by his bedside, hands folded, wedding ring still on, her eyes rimmed red from nights without sleep, and yet still open, still watchful. A priest had come the day before, a quiet man in a black cassock who'd known how to speak kindly in short sentences. He'd given Capone last rites. The oil still lingered faintly on his forehead, rubbed smooth into skin that had once been hard as leather, now waxen, sunken. There were no more bodyguards in the hallway, no suitcases filled with money, no phone calls to make, no orders to give, no names left to fear. The windows were open. The breeze lifted the curtains, and from the distance, waves whispered across the shallows like a lullaby played just for him. He had not spoken since the evening before. Not clearly, only fragments. A name Johnny, a number 17, a muttered reference to a garden that no longer existed. May didn't correct him. She just smoothed the blanket, brushed his thinning hair back, held his hand, and whispered that it was okay to rest. Outside, a nurse stood silently at the edge of the porch. Inside, the grandfather clock ticked like a slow, patient heart, and then it stopped. 7:25 a.m. The doctor called it. Al Capone was dead. The mansion could not echo with cries. There were no public announcements, no radio interruptions, no camera flashes bursting at the windows, just a stillness, the kind that settles when a long, brutal story finally exhales its final line. The news reached the press by noon. Wire services lit up across the country. Al Capone dead at 48. The end of an era. Scarface dies in seclusion. Some outlets wrote in cold detachment, listing charges, convictions, rivals, and violence. Others recalled a different Capone, the man who opened soup kitchens during the Depression, who handed out $100 tips, who once claimed he was only giving the people what they wanted. Chicago read the news in silence. Older shopkeepers muttered and shook their heads. Some laughed bitterly, others lit candles. Children, asked who he was, and the answers came in two tones, either with contempt or strange reverence, because Al Capone had not disappeared quietly. He had buried himself inside the bones of the city he ruled. His name still echoed in stairwells, still lingered on barroom walls, still whispered through streets that had been soaked in blood, then repaved in silence. The funeral was private, only family, a few quiet priests, one or two men who had remained loyal even as the empire crumbled. No limousines, no brass bands, no reporters allowed past the cemetery gates. May wore a black veil. Sonny held her arm. They said the rosary as they walked the slow path past the iron gates of Mount Carmel Cemetery. It was winter in Illinois. The ground was hard, the trees bare. A breeze crept through the rows of gravestones like an old story being told too quietly. They laid him next to his father and brother at his request, a simple gravestone, Alphonse G. Capone, 1899 to 1947. My Jesus mercy. No dates of glory, no titles, no mention of the city he once ruled, just stone and silence. But the world would not forget, and the days that followed, newspapers ran retrospectives. Some told the story of his rise Brooklyn to Chicago, speakeasies, bribed judges, blood on the sidewalk. Others tried to explain the myth, how a bootlegger became a household name, how a killer became a figure of fascination. Psychologists weighed in, sociologists, moralists. Was he a product of the times? A symptom of American ambition? A warning? Or just a man who understood power before he understood its price? The photographs printed that week showed two Capones. One, immortalized in his prime wide-lapelled suit, cigar in hand, confident smirk. Beneath the scar on his cheek, the other, bloated and blank-eyed, staring through the bars of Alcatraz with no recognition of the kingdom he once held. No monument was built in his honor, no museum erected in his name, and yet his face became legend, painted in murals, embossed on T-shirts, played in films, and whispered in bars. The name Capone no longer needed context. It meant crime. It meant fear. It meant charisma. It meant that for a time one man could hold a city by the throat and convince it he was giving it a kiss. But history is cruel to myths, and in the decades that followed, the stories sharpened. They no longer ended with suits and cigars, but with blood, decay, and silence. Writers dug into his records. Historians traced his violence. Victims were named. Corruption laid bare. The soup kitchens were remembered, but so were the funerals. The bribes, the men who vanished into snowstorms and alleys, never seen again. And yet, even in dissection, the fascination remained. Because Al Capone was not just a criminal, he was a reflection, a man who rose when the system failed and used its rules to rewrite his own. He proved that power could be worn like a smile, that fear could be given with a handshake, that violence could be orchestrated from a banquet table. And he proved finally that none of it lasts. The mansion on Palm Island still stands, the fountain still trickles, the palms still sway, tour boats slow as they pass, and guides point to the white stucco and tell the story. They say he went mad in there. They say his ghost still walks the dock with a fishing pole. They say sometimes you can see a light in the upper window, long after the house has gone dark. But Capone is not there. Not really. He is in the ledger books, in the old crime scene. Photos in the yellowed court transcripts, in the corner of old jazz clubs that remember the smell of whiskey during Prohibition, and in the name Capone, still whispered, still written, still remembered, long after the breath is gone. The phrase wasn't born from his lips. He didn't craft it, didn't request it, but when the ink dried and the headlines screamed across America, It fit him like a tailored suit. Public Enemy No. 1. It was 1930 when the label stuck. A name stamped by the federal government, not just as accusation, but declaration, a signal flare to the country. This is the face of fear. This is the shape of crime. This is the man we cannot ignore. There had been gangsters before Capone, safecrackers, stick-up men, killers in alleyways, but none of them moved like him. None smiled into the camera like him. None wore violence like it was velvet. To the Bureau of Investigation, he was a menace. To the newspapers, he was a seller of copies. To the people, he was something else entirely. A paradox. In one hand, he handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving. In the other, he held the ledger of the dead. Capone was not just a criminal. He was a performance, a walking contradiction dressed in silk pinstripes, with a carnation in his lapel and a pistol tucked neatly behind his belt. He was what happened when poverty met ambition, when prohibition opened a door, when charisma became a weapon sharper than any blade. The press loved him. Every camera angle, every courtroom smirk, every stroll past reporters with his hat tipped low and a wordless grin that seemed to say, "You can't touch me." Even his enemies admitted it. Capone had style, he had presence. He filled a room the way smoke fills a hallway, slowly but completely. By 1929, he was the most visible man in America, not elected to office, and it terrified the establishment, because every time a reporter pointed a lens at Capone, what they captured wasn't just a man, it was a symbol. He made his empire with booze. Yes, with bullets, yes, but also with something far more dangerous, perception. Capone understood the power of story. He knew that fear could be shaped, that admiration could be engineered, that myth, once written, was hard to erase, and so he played his part. The rise of the Public Enemy label wasn't just about crime, it was about image. J. Edgar Hoover, rising in power, saw Capone as both a threat and an opportunity. A nation reeling from the Depression needed villains. And here was one, tailor-made, Italian-born, wealthy, defiant, a product of Chicago's bloody alleys and opulent speakeasies. Capone became the template. The gangster's gangster, the one you feared, the one you quoted, the one you watched on the news, then imitated in whispers. Comic books followed, pulp magazines, radio dramas. Suddenly the airwaves crackled with Tommy guns. Dime store novels painted cities red with fiction based on his fact. Capone's silhouette, wide-brimmed hat, wide lapels, cigar clenched between teeth, became American shorthand for danger wrapped in elegance. And then came Hollywood, Edward G. Robinson and Little Caesar, 1931, James Cagney in The Public Enemy, also 1931, Paul Muni in Scarface, 1932, a film so overtly based on Capone that it sparked censorship battles from coast to coast. These weren't villains and shadows, they were anti-heroes, men of appetite, men of power, and in each of them America saw not only its fears, but its fantasies, because these men lived on their own terms, took what they wanted, dressed better than anyone, feared no one. They were monsters, yes, but charming monsters. And Capone, he watched it all from a cell, first in Atlanta, then in Alcatraz. His empire crumbled, his memory bloomed. As his body weakened, his myth grew. He was no longer just a man. He was a shadow cast across a generation. Children played cops and robbers. Not knowing the name came from a real man whose hands had ordered real deaths. Men bought suits styled like his, bars took on his name, and in smoky clubs, musicians sang of the streets he once ruled, jazz notes curving like bootleg roots through memory. But the title, Public Enemy, No. 1, it never let go. Not even In death, because it wasn't just about him, it was about us. Capone was a mirror, polished with blood, smoke, and charm, and him. The country saw what it wanted to see. To some, the warning of what happens when power corrupts without consequence. To the poor, he was the man who gave turkeys when the government gave excuses. To lawmen, he was a humiliation, a symbol of how easily the system could be bought. To journalists, he was gold. To families of the dead, he was a nightmare they never stopped hearing. The mirror fractured with every new telling. Was he brilliant or just brutal? Was he generous or strategic? Was he the son of American industry, a capitalist to the core, or just another tyrant in a nice hat? In a way, the title stuck because it felt too good to replace Public Enemy No One. It sounded biblical. Final clean, but the truth was never clean. Because behind every image was contradiction. Behind every mugshot was a man, confused, proud, frightened, addicted to his own legend and America. It liked what it saw in that mirror, because Capone was not just a villain, he was a character, a shorthand for rebellion, a symbol for ambition gone feral, a lesson carved in stone and yet repeated. Every generation has its Capone, another figure to fear and admire in equal measure, another man who rises on a wave of poverty, charisma, violence, and timing, another story the country can't look away from. Capone didn't invent the gangster, but he gave it form, he gave it a name, and whether America wanted to destroy him or become him, it never looked away. There is a kind of silence that settles on empires when their kings begin to fall. Not a crash, not a war cry, just the steady unraveling of sound, as though the walls themselves begin to forget the name they once whispered. 4. Alphonse Gabriel Capone. That silence arrived not in courtrooms, not in prison cells, but in the empty, echoing corridors of his own mind. He had built something vast, a kingdom of shadows and speakeasies, of whispered orders and champagne nights, of jazz and blood stitched together with charm and brutality. Chicago had bowed to him. Politicians took his phone calls. Cops looked the other way. The people, some feared, some worshipped, some simply watched, but all knew the name Capone. But every crown is heavy, and every king eventually must pay. The cost of his empire wasn't in dollars, it was in something far more sacred: time, health, family, memory. By the time he reached Alcatraz in 1934, the disease had already begun to hollow him out. Neurosyphilis, the cruel irony of a man who had conquered every enemy except the one inside his. Blood. The fortress walls of Alcatraz couldn't hold back what was happening to him. He heard voices, forgot names, spoke to people who weren't there. The man who once ordered murders with a flick of his finger now asked guards if his mother was coming to visit. Photographs from that time show it clearly. The puffiness beneath his eyes, the weariness in his stare. He no longer walked like a prince. He shuffled. His signature suits began to sag. The carnation in his lapel faded, and the man who once owned the city now waited in line for medicine, struggling to remember which day it was May Capone visited. Often loyal, patient, tired, she saw what the world didn't. The boy she met in Brooklyn. Not the myth, not the murderer, but the barefoot kid who once carried her books and spoke about owning a corner bar. She stayed even when the world had moved on, even when the newspapers called him a ghost, even when the headlines stopped printing his name. Their son, Sonny, stayed quiet. He never entered the family business. He watched it all from the periphery, the rise, the reign, the ruin. Later, when asked about his father, he would answer softly, "He was just Dad, that's all." But even that was complicated because Dad was sometimes lucid and sometimes lost. He would forget what year it was, forget he had ever ruled anything at all. Palm Island became the final stage, a mansion surrounded by salt air and Spanish moss, gates that no longer kept enemies out. Just memories in, he sat for hours in silence, sometimes staring at the water, sometimes humming old Italian lullabies no one recognized. The once mighty Capone would scribble nonsense in notebooks. He spoke of people long dead. He mistook nurses for childhood friends. He had a fishing rod he never used, a closet of suits he no longer wore, and a telephone that rarely rang. There's a cruelty to remembering too much, but Capone's fate was the opposite. He became a stranger to himself. The cost of kingship wasn't assassination. It wasn't a bullet in the street or a rival's betrayal. It was decay. From the inside. Out, slow, unforgiving. In one of his final letters, shaky, almost illegible, he wrote only 5 words. I was good once, right? No one knows who the letter was meant for, or what version of himself he was writing to. But it said everything. Legacy is a fragile thing. Some remember Capone as a monster, others as a flawed man who rose too far. But history doesn't care for neat endings, and in the end, he wasn't brought down by rivals. Not by gay men, not even by law. He was brought down by the very kingdom he built. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the violence, it seeped back in, turned his triumphs to ghosts, turned his name into legend, and then just echo. The house on Palm Island still stands. Tourists float by on boats, whispering stories they half remember. That's where the king of Chicago died, they say. But he didn't die there. Not really. He had been dying for years, piece by piece, until the only thing left was the myth. They buried Al Capone on a quiet January morning in 1947. The cold bit deep into the grass at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. A handful of mourners stood in silence, some family, some old associates who had outlived. The headlines, the marble stone bore his name, but it could never hold his story, because Capone didn't stay in the grave. Not really. He multiplied in reels of black and white film, in yellowed newspapers folded inside library drawers, in lyrics spit into microphones generations later. His blood ran thick, but his ink ran deeper. Within a year of his death, the first books arrived. Memoirs from agents who'd chased him, fictionalized tell-alls from men who claimed they once drank with him. He became an industry. Capone, the bootlegger. Capone, the kingpin. Capone, the devil. In a diamond pen, authors wrestled with him, each trying to distill what made him last. Not just the crimes, but the charisma. What made people still speak his name in hushed fascination? Why did a nation that had condemned him still dream about him? Hollywood, of course, embraced him. In the 1959 film Al Capone, Rod Steiger played him with snarling conviction. In The Untouchables, 1987, Robert De Niro turned him into a Shakespearean villain, brutal, grand, and oddly tender. The performances weren't accurate, but they were magnetic because Capone wasn't history anymore. He was myth. He walked the line between fact and fable, and that was the danger. By the 1990s, law enforcement manuals included sections on Capone's tactics, how he built a syndicate, how he used community outreach as camouflage, how he turned violence into theater. FBI trainers pointed to him as a blueprint, both for what to pursue and what to fear. And still, his shadow stretched further. In Chicago, bars named drinks after him. Tour buses traced his old bootlegging routes. Children posed in fedoras for stage photographs, unaware of the blood that once soaked. Those same streets he had become safe, packaged, marketable, the sins forgotten, the suits remembered. But for those who looked deeper, those who read the trial transcripts, the autopsy reports, the surveillance logs, the darkness never softened. And yet, even in that darkness, there was poetry, because Capone's legacy didn't end in textbooks or movies. It lived on in rhythm and rhyme. In hip-hop, his name became a motif, not out of admiration for his violence, but for what he represented: survival, power, fearlessness, flaws. Tupac referenced him. So did Nas, Jay-Z, Biggie, Kendrick. Each invoked Capone as a symbol of ruthless ambition, not as a hero, but as a mirror. Because in a world where respect was often denied by birthright, Capone was a man who took it. Right or wrong, he built from the ground up, used the same streets that judged him to carve out control. And for those who came from nothing, that meant something. But the paradox remained. Capone, who terrorized his city, was still being quoted like scripture. Capone, who brought bullets to Valentine's Day, still had murals painted in. His honor, Capone, who died broken and confused, had somehow become a blueprint, and that contradiction was the real legacy. He forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. What makes a man evil? His actions or his charm? Is corruption worse in a tailored suit? What happens when the villain is the only one who seems to understand the rules? Even in death, Capone played the long game, because he wasn't just a gangster. He was a warning about greed, about myth-making, about how easily power turns into legend when no one's brave enough to ask what it cost. In classrooms now, he's a case study in music, a metaphor in cinema, an icon. But to the families of those who disappeared in alleys, to the mothers who buried sons after drive-bys traced back to Capone's orders, to the cops who watched justice slip through bribes and silence, he's something else entirely. A ghost, one that smiles in black and white photos, raises a glass. In grainy footage, tips a fedora in a still frame, and never apologizes. Capone's name will never fade, because it no longer belongs to him. It belongs to us, to every generation that asks what power looks like, what it costs, and what it leaves behind when the crown rusts, blood fades, ink doesn't. The footage is grainy, faded around the edges like memory left out in the sun too long. But the shapes are unmistakable. A wide lawn, a small boy laughing, and a man, sturdy, smiling, not yet haunted, chasing him with arms open wide. It's Capone, not Scarface, not the butcher of Chicago, just all a father, a husband, wearing suspenders and a light-colored shirt rolled at the sleeves, running barefoot through the grass on Palm Island. There is no sound, only the soft hiss of aged film. No gunshots, no sirens, just the silent flicker of a man history never let rest. Cut to Brooklyn. A black and white photo. 1910. A tenement stoop. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, age 11, stands. Off-center, a newsboy cap droops over his brow. His shoes are scuffed. He's flanked by brothers. Mama's behind him in the window. The city was still shaping him then. Before the scars, before the suits, before Chicago called him west with promises dressed in blood, fade to yellowed paper. An FBI case file, crisp typewritten pages marked confidential. Name, Capone, Alphonse, aliases, Scarface. Dub, January 17th, 1899. Status, deceased. A red stamp bleeds the word closed across the header. But the case was never closed. Not really. Not in the minds of a country that made him more than a man, that turned his story into a riddle with no solution. A new shot now. May Coughlin's handwriting. A letter to a cousin, 1934. He is sick again. The doctors say it's the nerves. I tell him not to worry, but he always worries. There's love in the ink. Not fear, not pity, not forgiveness, just love. Then the audio returns, only briefly. A scratchy reel-to-reel recording. Capone's voice, soft, slurred. You know, I never meant for it to be like that. Never did. People talk too much. They don't know. It trails off, muffled, incomplete. The words of a man half gone. Not confessing, not repenting, just tired. Now the montage begins. Not of murders or trials, but of things we forget. A Christmas dinner. Capone carving turkey with a wide grin and a towel over his shoulder. A little boy, Sonny, perched in a high chair with cranberry sauce on his chin. May laughing, one hand on her husband's back, the other steadying a dish. The room is warm, and for 1 second, one breath, it looks like any other American family. Cut to the hospital room. Later years. Capone seated in a rattan chair by the window at Palm Island. A wool blanket draped across his knees, a fishing pole propped. But unused, he stares out toward the canal, expression blank. The boats pass like thoughts he can't quite catch. Once, his word could stop the city. Now he waits for nurses. His kingdom is an overgrown garden, and he doesn't remember where the throne. Used to be more home footage, Capone playing piano, poorly, and laughing at himself. He holds a cigar, but it's unlit. He fumbles the keys. May chuckles off screen, for all the blood he left in his wake. This was the part of him no one ever wrote about. Not because it wasn't real, but because it didn't sell. The screen splits, left side. Capone in a tailored gray suit, stepping out of a courthouse. Reporters screaming. Right side, that same man, 2 decades later, helping his grandson feed ducks by a pond. One world gave him fear, the other gave him peace, but neither could undo the other. Handwritten notes scroll across the screen. A ledger entry minus $1,928, $200. Food baskets, South Side, $50 donation, Little Flower School. The man-funded soup kitchens and bankrolled murders. Fed children, buried enemies. America never knew which version to believe, so it believed both. Capone was the villain we made into a myth, because we wanted to believe that even monsters had mothers, that even criminals prayed, that a man with blood on his hands could still love the way his son looked when he slept. Final image, a close-up on the gravestone, Alphonse G. Capone 1899147. M.Y. Jesus M-E-R-C-Y. The grass grows high around it. Coins lie at the base, offerings from those who came looking for something they couldn't name. Not admiration, not forgiveness, just a glimpse of the myth up close. And then silence, not the kind that comes from stillness, the kind that follows truth. Heavy, absolute, final, over. Black, the last line he wanted respect. He got a kingdom, but no man rules forever.